got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen, making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. A few months ago, we did a show with my old friend Julia Hobsbawm, who's an expert on work. And we entitled the interview, "The Death of the American Way of Work." We were borrowing, of course, in terms of the title for Julia's interview, from the great book by Jessica Mitford called The American Way of Death. And as it happened in our conversation with Julia, she noted that she'd met the great woman, Jessica Mitford. In fact, they'd spent an afternoon together, and their families were in some ways connected, I think, because her father, of course, was the great Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we're talking not about Julia or Eric Hobsbawm today, but about Jessica Mitford. There's a major new biography out. It's been embraced by the press. It's called Troublemaker, The Fierce, Unruly Life of Jessica Mitford, and it's by our guest, Carla Kaplan, who's joining us from Cape Cod. Carla, congratulations on the new book.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me tonight.
I was like subtitles. I was going to call you Jessica Carla. I'm sure I'm not the first or the last person to confuse the two of you. The subtitle of the book is The Fierce, Unruly Life of Jessica Mitford. What, Carla, is an unruly life? What does that mean?
Well, I think that in the case of Jessica Mitford, her life was unruly because she was constitutionally completely incapable of following authority or somebody else's rules. So it begins with her growing up as a very, very young child, absolutely incapable of adopting the standard view of her class, the standard aristocracy's way of looking at other people. She runs away from an aristocratic family and from England, spends her life in the United States for about 20 years as a communist activist and civil rights worker. And she's a devoted member of the Communist Party. She is a devoted activist. She's a remarkably effective civil rights worker, but she proves herself during all those years completely incapable of refraining from mocking the very people she's working most closely with. So her first piece of writing, actually, that is significant is a very funny little book called Life Itselfmanship, which is a send-up of Communist Party pretentious language. And she writes it when she's a member of the Communist Party and expects to be excoriated. Turns out people absolutely love it. And this continues throughout her life, that she can be absolutely in the middle of a movement or a group of people and constantly making fun of herself and of them. And in that way, her life is completely unruly. She's always inside and outside of everything she's a part of.
There was an unruliness, of course, to the Mitford family.
Yes.
There's an obsession now with the Mitfords. She had a fascist sister. She had another socialite sister. She accused her father of being a fascist. The British aristocracy, Carla, seems very good at training a Jessica Mitford. I'm not suggesting that there are many others within the British aristocracy, but it's not surprising that such an upper-class family would have produced someone like Jessica Mitford, is it?
Well, what she would have said, many people say, why alone amongst her six sisters was she the only radical? Why alone amongst her six sisters was she the only real social justice fighter? And I think she honestly would have flipped the question.
Hold on, I'm just jumping in. Don't tell me off for interrupting, but
sure, go right ahead.
That wasn't my question. My question was about being rebellious, and one can there's not necessarily a connection between being rebellious and believing in social justice, is there?
No, not necessarily at all. And her 5 sisters were all rebellious and not at all particularly interested in social justice. In fact, in the case of the 2 fascists, because we need to remember there were 2, quite the contrary. They were publicly and ardently disinterested in social justice, and they made rather a point of that, and rather a public point of that. I mean, it is absolutely the case that part of this sort of youth protocol of being an aristocrat, as it is in the United States, of being a child of the upper class, is a certain kind of rebellion, a certain kind of acting out, which is, of course, enabled by having wealth and connection, because you can rebel and you can act out, and typically you can escape consequences. In that way, I think her 5 sisters were completely typical of what you're suggesting, which is that a certain amount of youthful rebellion is not only not unheard of in the aristocracy, but is almost de rigueur, is almost expected. Her sisters tended to take it further than most of their friends. That's one of the reasons they fascinate, is they tended to be very extreme and exaggerated in anything that they did.
When I think of equivalent American families, I guess the Roosevelts come to mind, but the Kennedys as well, and this very unusual family, although they were more politically orthodox, they all tended to be on the left, or at least in the progressive rather than conservative.
Although until now, right?
Right, and I guess that's a good point. Yeah, RFK Jr. obviously is not a typical Kennedy in that sense.
No.
Old Joe Kennedy, of course, was a strict father. Jessica Mitford didn't have a Joe Kennedy in her life, did she?
No, she didn't at all. I mean, part of what makes her the interesting example of political rebellion is that when she first began to care deeply about social justice and other people, and to think that there was something wrong with the way her family was living and with how much they had when so many other people didn't have very much at all, she really didn't have models for this. She wasn't surrounded, by socialist cousins, except her famous second cousin, Esmond Romilly, who she knew of for years before she met him. He was quite a famous rebel. Ran away from boarding school, published his first book when he was only 16. But she described her position in the family as a lonely opposition. She described later in life feeling that her way of looking at the world was at such odds with the families that she couldn't quite understand them and they couldn't quite understand her.
But wouldn't it be fair to say, Carla, that there was quite a strong strain of leftist rebellion amongst the British upper classes in the 1930s in the world that Jessica Mitford grew up in? I'm not suggesting that it necessarily existed in the Mitford family, which tended to be much more sympathetic to fascism than communism. But it wasn't unusual for a young man or woman born of the British upper classes to fall in love with the promise of communism and the Soviet Union. Is that fair?
It certainly wasn't unheard of. I think she would have felt that it was much more common for a young person of that class in the 30s to grow up more sympathetic to fascism. But it is absolutely the case that those young aristocrats who rebelled against their class and who did move away tended to be much more vocal and much more critical. For one thing, they knew precisely of what they spoke. So, I mean, it's sort of, the same with ex-smokers, right? Nobody hates being around smoking as much as an ex-smoker. Nobody has as strong a critique of the class system as an ex-aristocrat. So I do think that was a piece of it. There was a little bit of snarky joking about class privilege, even amongst the aristocrats who didn't rebel. If we think about the behaviors of the bright young things, a certain amount of self-mockery was,
The Brideshead generation.
yeah, it was absolutely required, of that class. So I don't think it was absolutely unheard of. The place where she saw it most, however, was not in England. The other rebels she met who moved her, who turned her into a serious and committed political person, were not, on the whole, English aristocrats, although, of course, she knew some, and Esmond was one. But it was meeting aristocrats who had left their class in Spain that was so moving to her.
Yeah, the Spanish experience is really interesting. And Carla, Jessica Mitford wasn't the first or the last young English idealist to go to Spain and fight in the Civil War. Perhaps the best known of all these generation was George Orwell, who went, and as an anti-fascist, he remained an anti-fascist, but he came back from the Spanish Civil War also an anti-communist. Of course, he wrote very famously about this in his classic book, Homage to Catalonia. Did Jessica Mitford had the same awakening politically, recognizing that that there was as much trouble perhaps on the left as there was on the right in the Spanish Civil War?
It's an interesting comparison to Orwell. I think she had very much as profound an awakening through Spain, but I think it was to something else. So Orwell's awakening may have been in part to the Soviet Union. I don't think that was really the central issue for Jessica Mitford, frankly, or Esmond Romilly. I think her huge awakening, and Spain, I think, had a lifelong, really indelible, huge effect on her, was to the notion of solidarity. And what she saw in Spain was the commitment of international volunteers who came to a country that they had no connection to. They were, for the most part, not Spanish or of Spanish descent, but they believed in the Spanish Republic and they believed in democracy and they were opposed to fascism. And they came from all over the world and put their lives on the line for principle. I think coming from the British aristocracy, which is not known in particular for solidarity with people outside its class, this was an extraordinary lesson for her. And of course, she went with Esmond Romilly. And Romilly had been so early in Spain that there wasn't even an English brigade yet. When Romilly went to Spain, he had to fight with an Italian and German brigade, the Thelman Brigade, because there were so few English volunteers. He was very early and one of the only survivors of his battalion. So he had taken great risks, as did his brother Giles. And I think it was a profound lesson for her in the seriousness of political commitment.
Although her experience wasn't particularly serious, was it? She was kitted out in a winter ski suit to fire a rifle at Franco's troops, and she only managed to hit a tree. So she was no heroine in the war.
Oh, and I'm certainly not saying she was. But to say that she was profoundly affected for the rest of her life is quite different, right, than saying she would never have said she was a heroine of the war. Quite the opposite. In fact, she and Esmond Romilly were deeply concerned at the amount of attention that was being directed to their elopement and the way in which British resources were being expended to try to get them home. The most important thing she did was help see that nearly 300 refugees got out of Spain, which she was directly responsible for by agreeing to spend what turned out to be a brief amount of time on the British destroyer that was sent to fetch her home. And she was threatened that if you don't get on this destroyer, nobody's going to get out of Spain. So she got on the destroyer long enough to get off in a village in France. I don't think she would have for a moment said that her time in Spain was heroic. It was a profound lesson in other people's heroism. And I think she would have said, and I think she was right, frankly, that Esmond Romilly's time in Spain was heroic. He was in some of the bloodiest, most dangerous battles in all of the Spanish Civil War, both in Madrid and in Boadilla. And I think, he was the hero of that pair in terms of Spain, but it had a profound effect on her.
What made her a leftist, Carla? We mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, Julia Hobsbawm, her father, Eric Hobsbawm, probably the most influential leftist British Anglo-Viennese historian of the 20th century, schooled, of course, in Marx and that great European tradition of less leftist philosophy, historiography. Did your troublemaker, did she pick up Marx or Hobsbawm or Lenin or Trotsky or Gramsci when she was a young woman in the 1930s? What made her a leftist?
That question, what made her a leftist when the rest of the family was not, is always a difficult one, because she wasn't exposed to role models. She was never a theoretician. Not only do I not think she particularly became a leftist out of deep reading, certainly not the kind of reading Hobsbawm did or the kind of work he produced. I think she became a leftist out of a deep, even a child sense of justice and fairness. She was one of those children who was just from early on had that deep sense, and we see it in so many children, of fairness. The child who says, why should I have a bigger allowance than my younger sister? Instead of why don't I get more? And most people outgrow that sense of fairness. Lots and lots of young children have it. Many people outgrow it. Jessica Mitford not only never did outgrow that sense of fairness, but it became a serious sort of political guidepost for her. I think she would have flipped the question. So whereas we ask, why did she alone among this family develop this sense of social justice and Marxism and socialism? I think she always wondered why her sisters didn't. I think she always wondered why none of her sisters could see what was wrong with the British aristocracy and why none of her sisters could see that it was rather ludicrous for so few people to have so very much when so many people had so very little. I think to her, their inability to see that was really a lifelong puzzle, and her politics just made common sense to her.
Are you suggesting then, Carla, that anyone who spends their life struggling against what at least they perceive to be injustice is by definition on the left? Because I think a lot of conservatives and indeed liberals would strongly disagree with that.
No, I wouldn't say that at all. I think she came to Marxism and socialism out of a profound sense of social justice and social injustice. She didn't really, and she, as an adolescent, she wrote away from Marxist literature. So, there are famous stories of she and Unity occupying different sides of the nursery, and Unity carving swastika into the nursery window and Jessica carving a hammer and sickle into the window. And where did she get the hammer and sickle from? She wrote away. She heard about Marxism, she heard about socialism, she read about it in the newspapers, and she wrote away to get as much literature as she could. What I was saying was that she was never, even later in life, when she was a committed communist and working with the Civil Rights Congress of the East-based Communist Party, she was never so much a political theorist, certainly not in the sense of Hobsbawm or some of her own mentors, as she was a pragmatist. I am not saying everybody on the left became a communist, but it is also the case that becoming a communist in the United States in the 1930s and 40s was infinitely more common than people understand it to be, and certainly than it is today. Many leftists were drawn to the Communist Party because of its anti-fascist work and because of its anti-racist work. I mean, there was not a lot of highly developed anti-racist work going on outside of the Communist Party. Jessica Mitford and Bob Truhaft always said that's what drew them to the Communist Party. So I think it was once she got to California in particular, that she really did serious study of Marxism and socialism, I think she was drawn by anti-fascism.
So when you say she did serious study, what tradition did she exist in? I mean, again, coming back to your point about injustice, I mean, Orwell dedicated his life as well to injustice, and he
Yes.
ended as much as an anti-communist as an anti-fascist. Who was she most influenced when she came to California? What did she read?
So what I think most influenced her, I mean, she read everything. So she read Marx and she read Lenin and she read everything. But it is my sense that what most influenced her was her time at the California Labor School. So when she was in California, she was able to first be a student, and then she later worked with and worked for the California Labor School, which was a model of adult education that was very specific to Northern California. And really couldn't have existed in the same way anywhere else. But here was somebody who had never had a formal education of any kind and who deeply resented it, who had always wanted to go to school. And, they had, yes, did the family have governesses? Yes, they taught them almost nothing. Did her mother use the PNEU system? Yes, but never paid much attention to it. So she had very little education. And the California Labor School was a model of adult education that, as I understand it, is actually more common in England than it's ever been in the United States, but of these very serious classes and curricula drawn widely from experts across all sectors of Northern California society, and co-created, co-sponsored, co-funded by the Communist Party and labor unions throughout Northern California. So as I understand it, the California Labor School was a joint effort of the unions and the party. And the faculty I've seen were by no means only communists. If there was a class on nutrition, it would be taught by famous chefs. If there was a class on thermodynamics, it would be taught by a scientist. And these classes were free. Or nearly free. They were extensive. They were everything from photography to dance to journalism to nutrition to history. And she had an extraordinary education at the California Labor School, which I think had a profound effect on her. She was also able, even when she first came to the United States, to devise for herself an enormous program of study. So one of her other very important political mentors was Virginia Durr, because she lived her first years in California with Virginia and Clifford Durr, known for their civil rights work throughout the South and in Washington, D.C. And Virginia Durr had an extensive library, and Decker read her way through it.
In a sense, then, if one wants to sort of locate Jessica in an English tradition, I want to come to America in a few minutes. Yeah. But in the English tradition, it was an affinity and affection for working class life. You can find that in the work of E.P. Thompson or D.H. Lawrence. There's a very long tradition of this. As a girl, presumably the Mitfords had servants, chauffeurs, cooks. Did she sympathize with them? Did she understand that, and I assume that this must have been a kind of awakening for her, that her life was profoundly privileged and it required cooks and chauffeurs and nannies and other members of the quote unquote working class to enable this kind of privilege?
She did understand that, and she understood it as fundamentally a wrong of some sort. It seemed to her, as you know, I'm sure you know, the entire village in essence worked for the family, whether they were, running the self-engineered water electric plant, or they were cleaning up the fireplace, or they were cooking for the family. They didn't have a lot of people in the village who didn't work for the family. Everybody was connected to the family in some way. And it did strike her, even when she was very young, as profoundly wrong. She was part of an early organization that, to me, it's hard to find an American parallel to the sunbeams. I don't know if you're familiar with the sunbeams as an
No, I'm not. I mean, I know the name, but I'm not that familiar.
I guess the closest that I can find in the United States context would be big brother and big sister. And the idea that somebody who has a certain amount of wealth and privilege sort of semi-adopts somebody who is poorer and has fewer resources. And the idea of the sunbeams was that a well-established young girl like Jessica Mitford was at the time would adopt a working class girl and send her used things. So Jessica Mitford had been sending her sunbeam her leftover clothing, her leftover books, her leftover toys, and she was very entranced with the idea of her sunbeam. And she wanted her sunbeam to come to the Cotswolds, to come to the house and be part of her life. And she wanted to exchange places with her and see how her sunbeam lived. And she begged and begged and begged her mother to bring her sunbeam to, this was not Estill anymore, this was Swinbrook, this was the second house. And unfortunately, what her mother did was hire her sunbeam at 14 years old as a tweenie, or a between maid in the house, so that she was bringing Decca's sunbeam to serve Decca as a lower servant in the house. And the sunbeam came for 3 days, cried nonstop, and was sent home. And Decca was horrified. I mean, she was so embarrassed. She was supposed to be befriending this girl, and instead this girl ended up working for her. And, that was one of many experiences that taught her that there was something very insulating about her privilege, that her privilege was not getting her close to the people she was interested in. She was deeply curious about all the people who worked in the house, about the kinds of lives they left, about the kinds of money they made and what they did with it. She was just interested in everything outside the family. And so that experience was just a typical sort of, failure of her trying to get outside the class bounds.
Yeah, and maybe I'm asking the wrong question or thinking of it in the wrong way. I guess the more you speak, the more it seems to me that one of the reasons why Jessica Mitford's life was so remarkable was because she didn't have some classical education. She didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. She wasn't schooled in Marx or Trotsky or anyone else. Thinking about her aloud, one thinks of somebody like Hannah Arendt, similar age, who also had a fierce, unruly life, but in a very different sense. The thing about Mitford, Jessica Mitford's life, is its spirit, isn't it, Carla? I mean, she wasn't Arendt. She's not going to be remembered for her theories, for her books on totalitarianism. It's her life that's the model.
Well, and I just would add, I completely agree with you, and I would add her writing to that. So let me just say, first of all, she would have been the first person to say she was no theoretician, and she wasn't. She was not theoretically minded. She was not theoretically inclined. She was not particularly theoretically tolerant. This is not somebody who spent a lot of time reading theory or engaging in the kind of really internecine theoretical debates that ended up characterizing and then splitting the American Communist Party. She wasn't interested in factionalism. She was a very practical person. I think it was the life, but I also think it was the writing. And this goes back to something you just said about her growing up without a formal education and without a formal mentor. One of the things that is so striking about her writing is the distinctiveness of that voice. And I compare it in its distinctiveness to both Jane Austen and Virginia Woolf, which is to say, if you have an anonymous sentence on the page, not identified, but it's Jane Austen or it's Virginia Woolf, you recognize it instantly. You know precisely who is speaking because the voice is so distinctive. That is also true of Jessica Mitford's voice. Her written voice, it leaps off the page as distinctive as her own. And she developed that kind of remarkably distinctive literary voice without training. And that is an extraordinary achievement for any writer. And it may be in part because she didn't have training, that she could just listen to her own voice because there wasn't a lot of sort of formal training getting in the way of that, if you know what I mean.
But I wonder, coming back to this, the books, and I mean, of course, the two that are best known, The American Way of Death and another wonderful book that's very
Yes.
popular, Ons and Rebels, about her childhood. One of the reasons why she's such a distinguished and popular writer, at least in that context, is that she doesn't really bring her politics to this writing. Is that fair? To these classic books. I mean, maybe in other works, which I'm not familiar with, but I haven't read The American Way of Death for a while. But for me, I remember it as this brilliant cultural, this hilariously brilliant and acute cultural critique of the American way of life. It never occurred to me that here was a Marxist or a leftist writing. She could have just as easily been a liberal or even a conservative.
Well, although, you know, the overall representation of capitalism might, as rapacious, of capitalism as a system that is too vulnerable to the kind of exploitation which she then details, that does animate the book. And I'm not sure we'd see that quite from everybody. I mean, I guess I would say one of the things that distinguishes her muckraking in American Way of Death, first of all, it's the humor. It's just that she's simply hilarious. That she could be so funny about death. Of course, she was so funny about her family, but then she's just unbelievably funny about death in the funeral industry. But, you know, she really does revive that genre of muckraking in the 1960s.
But it's funny muckraking.
Yes.
I mean, it could have been Auburn War writing, of course, who was anything but a leftist, was a fascist. And I don't quite know how she managed to do that. Maybe it's because she didn't have this very formal leftist education.
It also could have been the kind of muckraking that was done by Rachel Carson in 19.
Yeah, but Rachel Carson wasn't very funny.
Well, that's what I'm saying. She, I mean, it could have been, because they're both publishing in the same year. People forget it's 1963 for them both. It's Jessica Mitford who's hysterically funny. But I do think that one of the things that distinguishes her from somebody who I believe follows in her footsteps, although he never really credits her, like Ralph Nader, is the extent of her distrust of capitalism.
Although Nader isn't very funny either. I know the guy. I've been on the show. I mean, he's not exactly a bundle of laughs.
Do we have any other muckraker who is as funny as she is ever? I mean, I can't think of anybody.
Yeah, Steinbeck comes to mind as well. He wasn't very funny either.
No. And we think about either the original muckrakers in a turn of the last century. God knows there's almost nothing funny in The Jungle. I warn my students, if they're going to read The Jungle, they have to not eat, for a few hours beforehand. It's such a not funny book. To somebody like Ehrenreich, who's witty. Ehrenreich is incredible, I think, clever.
Yeah, or was anyway.
Right. But I mean, as a writer, I would say is, right?
Yeah.
But isn't.
And her daughter's inherited that. She was on my show. She's very good, actually. Although I'm not sure she's a leftist.
But Mitford's ability to combine the humor with the attack is what makes her so incredibly distinctive. And I would agree that she does not come across, I mean, I think she comes across, as an anti-capitalist and a progressive in those books. But, she never identifies with a particular left faction. That's actually true at the entire time she's in the Communist Party. The Communist Party in the East Bay is much less split.
But did this, Jessica, again, apologies, Carla, not Jessica, did this reflect very good judgment that she joined the Communist Party? I mean, it's slightly absurd, isn't it? How long was she in the party for?
Wait, in the 1930s and 40s, slightly absurd? I don't think so at all.
You don't?
No,
I mean, the Communist Party that was sympathetic to Stalin.
Wait, but in the 1930s and 40s, before any of the Khrushchev revelations come out, in the East Bay of California, which we have to remember is a version of the Communist Party very, very different from New York. So far less theoretical, but also much less connected to Soviet doctrine, Soviet leadership. The Communist Party in the East Bay of California, it's very much its own thing. And it is doing extraordinary civil rights work that basically nobody else is touching. So the kind of work that she starts doing through the Civil Rights Congress of the East Bay Communist Party, where she is working on labor issues, housing discrimination issues, and specifically on police brutality issues. Nobody else is doing that work. So for her, I think it's a completely logical and formative trajectory to have taken, because the other thing about the Communist Party during this period is it is providing opportunities for leadership and growth and development of skills, particularly for women, because so much of the East Bay leadership, we have to remember, is female, that basically nobody else is providing. I don't think she could have become the writer she became if she hadn't had the sort of training as a journalist that she had in the East Bay Communist Party. No, I think it made perfect sense for her.
So let's talk, Carla, let's talk about this transatlantic narrative in her life. She went from being the daughter of this bizarre Mitford family, now who's so much in the news, to the East Bay, to the Communist Party, to Oakland, to Southern California. She brings a remarkable wit and I don't know about the fierceness, but certainly an unruliness to America that's very unusual, isn't it? Especially in the context of the American left, who, as we've hinted earlier, tend to be rather serious and take itself very seriously. Was she comfortable on the left? Did the other leftists take her seriously, or were they irritated by her endless joking?
She expected them to be irritated. I mean, she was incapable. She would never have survived in the party in New York. It was much more disciplined and centralized, and she couldn't have been so silly and made jokes. But there was a bit different sense of play in the East Bay, and she expected.
You keep on saying the East Bay. We're talking about Berkeley or Oakland?
In the Berkeley, Oakland, in the larger sort of Berkeley, Oakland part.
The corridor, the left, the People's. I used to live there. The People's Republic of Berkeley, right?
That's where the party was much more playful there than it was. Even the party reading groups, they would read non-Marxist literature. They would read a novel and talk about it.
Well, that was an achievement.
So I mean, it was a complete. She expected people to be much more annoyed with her joking and her silliness and her, inability to stop teasing. I mean, she carried the teasing of her childhood right into her political life and right into her writing. Both are profoundly influenced by that childhood teasing. She thought people were going to be much more annoyed. But the thing apparently about Jessica Mitford, it was everybody wanted to be in her company. She was not just funny, she was incredibly fun to be with. And so everybody chose to think they were not the target of her tease. Everybody chose to think, well, somebody else is the target of her tease, because they wanted to be in her company. And she frankly got away with murder. She got away with teasing everybody around her and everybody she worked most closely with. And she just made it work for her. And I don't know if she could have done that too many other places in the country, frankly, but it absolutely worked for her. And I have wonderful stories. I had interviews with many people who knew her, who talked about her absolutely relentless teasing and how everybody tried to line up with it, right? So that they could join in with the fun.
Did you ever have any interactions with Chomsky?
Not that I was able to determine.
Because I don't think he would have put up with her joking, would he?
I don't know. I mean,
he seems to me probably the most prominent American leftist of the post-war age.
Yeah. I would have loved to see her with Bernie.
Maybe they're one day they'll have an argument.
I'd love to see her with, somebody like Bernie Sanders. That would be interesting.
Yeah.
I think they would have gotten along famously with Mamdani. I think they would have been hysterical to have at the same dinner party. I'd love to have a dinner party of Jessica Mitford and Mamdani. That would be fun.
Yeah. Well, maybe you will one day. Carla, you've mentioned race a few times. I mean, she grew up in a profoundly unjust world of the England of the 30s as an aristocrat, all sorts of injustices, but she didn't grow up in Jim Crow, 1930s England. It was a different kind of injustice. How did the impact of race and of the legacy of slavery and the reality of Jim Crow, how did that change her mind when she came to America, change her mind about injustice and define her unique kind of leftism, this Anglo-American humorous leftism of the post-war age? Was it the thing that drove it, the racial injustice of America in the post-war age?
I think what first drove her was anti-fascism, again, coming out of Spain and trying in some way to contend with having two sisters who were fascists, trying to wrap her mind around that. I don't think it's right to say her politics grew out of some sisterly rebellion against Diana and Unity. It's way too simple. But I think she certainly was trying to wrap her mind around the fact that she had two fascists, one of whom had serious impact, particularly through Mosley, on, on politics and on the war. And she did blame them for Esmond's death. So I think first she was an anti-fascist, and then in the United States, working for the Civil Rights Congress, I think then she developed an understanding of race. I don't think she particularly had a deep understanding of race when she was in England. And her family was not particularly connected, as you say, with racial struggle. They were famous as anti-Semites. Both of her grandfathers were famous anti-Semites. They were enormously proud of their anti-Semitism. And I think she carried some of her understanding of that into her understanding of race.
And she married an American Jew, didn't she?
She married an American Jew. He was of Hungarian descent, and he was not in any way a religious Jew. He was a cultural Jew and a Jewish leftist, and very much part of that sort of milieu. So I do think that for her, again, that was an enormous piece of the education that followed Spain. The work she did in the Civil Rights Congress was everything. She did everything from, running the mimeograph machine to going door to door in Black Oakland. And the thing about Jessica Mitford, and this was true of her as an activist, and it's true of her as a muckraker, she was a very good listener. I'm not sure that was true of everybody else in her family, and it may not seem true of her because she was quite imperious and loved a microphone. She was really happy to talk.
Did she ever meet James Baldwin?
And I think she met him once extremely briefly. I don't think they ever were alone in a room together, as far as I can tell, which is unfortunate because I'm doing a lot of co-appearances with Nick Boggs, whose marvelous new biography.
Yeah, I want to get him on the show. Actually, when you see him, tell him I want to interview him.
I will tell him he's my ex-undergraduate student from Yale University.
Oh, well, you can help me get him. I've seen the book and it looks interesting. Finally, you've been very generous with your time, Carla. I have to ask, I know it's a bit of a dumb question, but I'm sure everyone's asking you the same thing. You mentioned you'd love to have a dinner party with Jessica Mitford and Mandami. One has to ask what she would have made of a certain Donald Trump. I mean, I'm sure she would have found him hilarious and profoundly objectionable, but what wisdom could Jessica Mitford bring to those of us who are not particularly keen on Donald Trump?
Well, this is one of the two reasons we need her so desperately right now. One, just as you said, her spirit.
I agree.
Her spirit was so indomitable, and she fought back by staying spirited. So, you've already identified the one, but the other is she would have absolutely, had a field day with Trump. And I, there have been a few successful politicians who have gone after him with humor. I'm not normally, a fan of a huge fan of some of them, but Newsom has been, very effective going after him with humor. A few other people have been. Mandami has been very effective. She would have had a very deep understanding of the narrowness of bullies. She had a keen insight into the sort of paranoia and the insecurity of bullies. And so much of Trump's crazy behavior, and it's insane. Well, we're going to go to war with Venezuela. Are you kidding me? Is the most profound kind of insecurity. The ballroom is insecurity, the hostility to anybody who criticizes him. I mean, he's just a profoundly insecure person, as most bullies are. And she would have known how to punch him straight in the nose with her humor. And I think we need that, which is not to say we can't take his regime seriously. We have to take his regime seriously. He's hurting and killing people. So we have to be serious about that. At the same time, we absolutely have to laugh at him, because you have to laugh at fools. And she would have gotten us to laugh at him. And we need that.
Yeah, I agree. I remember a couple of years ago interviewing Ralph Nader. I said to him, where did you get your political consciousness? He said, from growing up with bullies and learning that experience. I don't think Jessica Mitford was quite as bullied, at least in school, as Nader, but maybe her experience was within the family. Fascinating conversation, Carla, Kaplan. Thank you so much. And thank you for the book, Troublemaker, The Fierce, Unruly Life of Jessica Mitford. We need her right now. So we'll get you back on the show, and you'll have to get me Nick Boggs, because I'd love to have him on the show to talk James Baldwin. Thank you so much, and congratulations on the success of the book.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure. Bye-bye.